I have here in my hand a small pea-green volume. It is entitled The Way of a Pilgrim, also known sometimes as The Pilgrim's Tale. It is the story of an anonymous Russian pilgrim in the 19th century who goes from place to place, staying at different monasteries. He hears in a sermon the words quoted from St. Paul, "Pray without ceasing." And he wonders, how is this possible? How is it possible to pray not just as an occasional activity, but as the activity of our whole life? How can prayer be, he asks himself, a continual state? He asks many people for the answer, and finally he is satisfied when an elder, a starets, in one of the monasteries where he goes, tells him about the Jesus prayer. The short invocation, "Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner." The elder tells him, "Say that prayer as frequently as possible, and this will be the doorway into continual prayer." He follows the elder's advice. Wandering from monastery to monastery, on foot through the forest, he says the prayer continually. I shall come back later to the Jesus prayer. But now I want to consider particularly what the pilgrim carried with him. In his knapsack he had a large volume entitled the Philokalia, or in Slavonic, Dobrotolubie. And it is about this volume that I wish to speak in these talks. Here, in my initial talk, I want to ask three questions. What, who, and why? What is the Philokalia? What is this volume that the pilgrim took with him everywhere and kept consulting? Secondly, who are the editors of the Philokalia? In fact, the title page of the book doesn't bear any names at all of who are the authors or editors. And then thirdly, why did they edit the Philokalia? So let's start first with what is the Philokalia. It is a book originally published in Venice in 1782. A large folio volume, double column, 1,200 pages, all in Greek. It contains 36 authors extending from the 4th to the 15th century. They are all Greek writers except for one, St. John Cassian. There's a summary of his writings translated from the Latin. But this exception is apparent rather than real, because John Cassian learnt his monastic theology in the Christian East, in the land of Egypt, where he was in his youth before he travelled to the West. These 36 authors are all concerned in different ways with the life of prayer. In other words, this is a book about inner action rather than outer activities. It doesn't tell you in detail about the services of the Church, although, as we shall see, there are important references to baptism and the Eucharist. It doesn't go into detail about the rules of fasting, although it does emphasize that fasting plays an important part in our spiritual journey. It doesn't discuss social or political action by Christians, although it does underline how love for others is fundamental to our Christianity. No, it is concerned basically with inner work, the work of prayer, searching for God in the kingdom of the heart. Interestingly, at the end of the edition published in 1782, there is one page, not in Greek, but in Italian, a licenza, or authorization, by the censors of the University of Padua, saying that there is nothing in this book contrary to the Holy Catholic faith or to good morals. But though it has in this way a Roman Catholic imprimatur, in fact the book is entirely Orthodox. It was edited by Orthodox Christians, and it is intended for an Orthodox Christian audience. Why was it printed in Venice and not in Constantinople or somewhere else in the Christian East? There is an easy answer to that one. Until the 19th century, the authorities of the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish authorities, did not allow Christians to have their own printing press or to issue their own books. There were attempts to establish a printing press in the 17th century for the Greeks in Constantinople, and another attempt in the middle of the 18th century. But both of these efforts came to nothing because they were quickly closed down by the government. So if the Greek Orthodox wanted to publish books, they had to do so in the West. And it was Venice, from the 16th century onwards, where most of their books were printed. Why Venice and not Rome or Paris? The answer there is that the Venetians adopted a generous and liberal policy towards Orthodox Christians. In Rome, books by Orthodox authors could not have been printed unless they pretended to be Roman Catholic. But the Venetian authorities were quite content to allow the Orthodox to have their own printing presses and to issue their own books. From the late 16th century, the Greek Church in Venice was not compelled to commemorate the Pope, and it was able to commemorate only the ecumenical patriarch. So this is why the Philokalia was printed in the West, even though it was meant for an Eastern audience, and almost all the copies after the printing were shipped out to the Levant. So that is what the Philokalia is basically. A publication of spiritual texts concerned with the life of prayer, with the ascetic and mystical life. It is probably the most important and influential publication to appear during all the 400 years of the Turkish period of Orthodox Christianity. Now I come to my second question, who? Who is responsible for this book? There are two editors. Their names do not appear on the title page, but we know who they are. They have both been glorified as saints in the Orthodox Church. They are Saint Macarius of Corinth and Saint Nicodemos of the Holy Mountain. Saint Macarius of Corinth came from a distinguished aristocratic family. He was briefly Bishop of Corinth, but he was removed from office because he was accused of sympathy with the Russians during the Russo-Turkish War. After that he spent a wandering existence. And in the year 1777 he came to the Holy Mountain of Athos. And there he met a monk on the mountain called Nicodemus. Nicodemus came from the Greek island of Naxos. He was born in 1749. As a child he showed high intelligence. He also felt attracted to a service in the church. Now, it would have been normal for someone of high intelligence, a young Greek, who wished to serve the church, to go to the West and study there in some institute of higher learning, Roman Catholic or Protestant. And then probably he would have come back to teach in one of the schools, the different important schools in the Ottoman Empire which the Greeks maintained. Usually they bore the title School of the Nation. And then probably after directing one such school for a time, the person in question would become a bishop. Nicodemus did not follow that path. Instead of going to the West, instead of seeking a higher education from non-Orthodox sources, he chose to go and become a monk on the Holy Mountain. And there he lived for most of his life, up to his death in 1809. Nicodemus was in many ways a remarkable person. Among other things, he had a photographic memory. The story is told that one day, on Holy Saturday, he was attending a service in one of the hermitages on the mountain of Athos. The service on Holy Saturday morning has 15 Old Testament lessons. And suddenly they found they hadn't got the book with these lessons in them. No matter. Nicodemus, so the story goes, recited all 15 lessons without hesitation from memory. His works are full of quotations from the Fathers. I doubt if he looked them all up in the sources. He probably was quoting from memory. And Nicodemus was author of a whole series of different books. The book about Nicodemus by Constantine Kevarnos, for example, in the bibliography lists 109 works that Nicodemus wrote, translated, or edited. And some of those works amount to about 1,000 pages. He didn't waste time. Actually, he lived not in one of the main monasteries on Athos, but in various of the small hermitages. The main monasteries have lengthy services and would allow a monk little time for scholarly writing. Nicodemus probably practiced the Jesus prayer rather than reciting the whole divine office, and this would have given him more time for his study and his editorial and authorial work. 109 texts, sometimes Lives of the Saints, editions of the church services, but most important of all, the Philokalia. In fact, it seems that the part of Macarius in the Philokalia was more important than that of Nicodemus, though he's often regarded as the only editor. It was Macarius, apparently, who made the original selection of what works to include in the Philokalia, and then he brought the texts to Athos. Then Macarius wrote a general introduction, and he wrote particular introductions to each author or collection of texts, and he edited the book as a whole. When Macarius had received back from Nicodemus the edited version of the texts, he went to Smyrna, raised money for the printing of the book, and sent it off to Venice. Now, why was the Philokalia prepared and edited? What is its purpose? Here we have to take into account that the late 18th century was a turning point for Greek orthodoxy. Up until then, the general spirit prevailing in Orthodox theology and spirituality was that of Byzantium. We can say that the Byzantine period did not end in 1453 with the fall of the city of Constantinople to the Turks, but it continues through until the late 18th century. It's significant that the Greeks didn't call themselves Greeks or Hellenes. They usually called themselves Romans, Romei. They saw themselves as heirs to the Roman Empire, which had become Christian in the 4th century. It's true that in the 17th century, Orthodox theology was very heavily influenced by the West, but the underlying spirit still continued to be Byzantine. The Greeks of that period still looked back to Constantinople as their ideal. They looked back to the Greek fathers as their guides and mentors. From the second half of the 18th century, a new spirit enters into Greek orthodoxy, a spirit influenced by the Enlightenment, the Aufklärung, the kind of outlook that prevailed among the French encyclopedists, whose spokesman in particular is Voltaire. There's a story told of a monk on Patmos who went down one day to the harbour, found a French ship had just arrived, and encountering one of the members of the ship, he immediately asked him, "Tell me, I must know, give me the answer, is Voltaire still alive? Is that great benefactor of the human race still active?" I suspect that story is apocryphal, but there's no doubt that there were, in the later 18th century, many Greek Orthodox who, while still remaining loyal to their church, admired the secular spirit of people like Voltaire. And so there now comes in a new spirit into Greek Orthodoxy. Many Greeks no longer look back to Christian Constantinople as their ideal. They look behind that to pre-Christian Athens, the Athens of the 5th century before Christ, the Athens of Pericles. Their ideal is not the Church of the Holy Wisdom at Constantinople, but the Parthenon on the Acropolis. Their admiration is given not so much to the Greek fathers as to the Hellenic authors of an earlier period. Socrates, Plato, Thucydides, Aristotle. Now, there was no quick transition here. Indeed, these two elements, which we could call the Romaic and the Hellenic, continue side by side in Greek history and culture right up to the present time. The division between the Romeos and the Hellene runs through the heart of each Greek, I think, and each Greek draws on both traditions. But there's no doubt that in the later 18th century, many people, not only laity but members of the clergy, began to admire more and more the secular outlook of the West. Movements such as Freemasonry had a large influence in the Orthodox world, not only Greek but Russian. Now, this provoked a reaction. People such as Macarius of Corinth and Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain were greatly disturbed by this new spirit, this spirit which to them seemed secular, seemed to be to them a betrayal of the Orthodox heritage. And a movement emerges in the later 18th century known as the Kollivades, Kollivades. That title is derived from kolliva, meaning the boiled wheat that is used at memorial services. The Kollivades advocated, among other things, a strict obedience to the rubrics of the Church. Therefore they held that memorial services, at which kolliva is used, should take place only on the correct day of the week, which is Saturday, and that memorial services should not be celebrated on Sunday, as had become the widespread custom. This led to a major dispute on the Holy Mountain. Some people said you must have memorial services on Saturday because that is the day on which Christ rested in the tomb. But others argued it's equally appropriate to have memorial services on Sunday, the day on which he rose from the dead. The Kollivades stuck to the strictly traditional practice of having the services only on Saturday. But they were concerned with much more than simply an exact observance of the rubrics of the Church. They were concerned to reaffirm the value of Orthodox tradition in the face of what they saw as the corrosive influence of Western secularism, of a mentality that was no longer rooted in Christian Byzantium, but was returning to pagan Hellas. And so they instituted a widespread program of what we might call ressourcement, return to the sources. Do not trust the West, they said. This will prove to be a snare and delusion. Do not look to salvation from the Franks. Remain faithful to your Orthodox heritage. Indeed, Saint Nicodemus even says that we should regard the Ottoman Empire with its domination over Greek Orthodoxy as an act of God's providence, because it has kept us safe from the undermining influences of Roman Catholicism. The Colivades, in a positive way, instituted then a widespread program, both sacramental and educational. On the sacramental side, they insisted in particular on the importance of frequent communion. In Orthodoxy at that period, and indeed later, it was the custom for people to receive communion only 3 or 4 times a year, and many people only received communion once a year at Easter. I can remember that this was the situation in many places in England when I first became Orthodox 50 years ago. I can remember occasions at Oxford when, in the Divine Liturgy, not a single person came up for communion. Fortunately, things have changed. The Colivades insisted that communion should be frequent. Indeed, they even spoke of continual communion. And they advocated, where possible, that communion should be daily, which is very unusual in the Orthodox Church. Saint Nicodemus and Saint Macarius were responsible, among other things, for publication on frequent communion. That was one side of the renewal program of the Colivades. Return to your Eucharistic roots. The Church is not just a cultural association, not just a way of nurturing nationalism. The Church is a Eucharistic communion. Its essential activity is to celebrate the holy mysteries of communion in the body and blood of the Saviour. Secondly, the Colivades had an elaborate educational program to make available the true sources of Orthodox thinking, which are the Holy Fathers. And so they edited a series of texts of different fathers. In their program in particular, they emphasized the mystical writers of Byzantium, such as St. Simeon the New Theologian in the 11th century and St. Gregory Palamas in the 14th century. And the Philokalia, this vast collection of spiritual texts, formed a central element in their program of back to the sources. So this is the reason why the Philokalia, among other works, saw the light as a witness to what the Colivades, and in particular Macarius and Nicodemus, believed was the authentic tradition of orthodoxy. Now, on the title page of the Philokalia, it says, "It is for the common use of the Orthodox." And in his preface, Nicodemus emphasizes that this book is not intended only for monks or clergy. It is intended for all Christians. He goes on to say that the command of St. Paul, "Pray without ceasing," is not addressed solely to monastics. It is addressed to everyone. It is a universal ideal. Continual prayer, says Nicodemus, is not to be practiced only in caves and on mountain tops and in the desert. It can be practiced also in the city. It is addressed, the command, pray without ceasing, to lay people fully committed to a life of service in the world, to courtiers in kings' palaces, says Nicodemus. Here I think of an attractive example from the 14th century, not actually mentioned by Nicodemus. The emperor was presiding over the Senate, and among the senators was the father of one of the great mystical writers of the Orthodox tradition, the father of St. Gregory Palamas. The emperor turned to him and addressed a question to him, and the other did not reply. The emperor was somewhat surprised. When the supreme ruler addresses a question to you, you listen attentively and you answer with care. You don't simply remain silent. Then the emperor noticed that Palamas's father was in fact practicing mental prayer. Presumably that means he was reciting the Jesus prayer. Realizing this, he did not insist on an answer to his question, but left him alone and moved on to the next item on their agenda. I like to think that in the Houses of Parliament here in England, there are members of Parliament who during the debates are reciting the Jesus prayer. I do not know how far that is actually the case, but that is the kind of spirit I would like to see in our Houses of Representatives and in our Senates. That to me is very revealing for the spirit that prevailed in late Byzantium. Mental prayer, the Jesus prayer, praying without ceasing. These were ideals valued also by the laity, as by the clergy. Valued by those in the midst of all the activities of the city, as much as by those in the solitude of the desert. Such, at any rate, is the spirit that inspires the Philokalia. Nicodemus and Macarius meant it as a book for everyone, whatever their status, whatever their condition in life. This is rather surprising, in fact. First, because it is an extremely weighty volume. The pilgrim may have carried it around in the Slavonic translation in his knapsack, but most Christians would not find it a very convenient volume to have in their briefcases. Secondly, almost all the texts in the Philokalia are given in the original Greek, the Greek used in the patristic and Byzantine periods. By the 18th century, this would not have been easily understood by most Greeks, just as it is not easily understood by Greeks today. There have been many changes in the Greek language. In other publications, Nicodemus used the modern Greek, demotic, the spoken Greek of the time. He provided patristic texts in paraphrase. But in the Philokalia, the texts are given in the original language, except for a few texts at the end which are given in a modern Greek paraphrase. I suspect they were put in by the printer in Venice to make up the volume to the requisite number of pages. Be that as it may, even though the texts in the Philokalia are in the ancient Greek language, yet Nicodemus is quite emphatic. This is for all Christians. He does not imagine there is one spirituality for the clergy or for monks and nuns, and another spirituality for the laity. No, for him there is one spiritual way, shared by all Christians alike. So that in outline is what the Philokalia is, and why it was published, to recall the Greek nation at a time of crisis, after centuries of oppression by the Muslim authorities, to the true sources of their Christian faith. In the late 18th century, orthodoxy was at a low ebb in the Turkish realm. There were, in the late 18th century, massive instances of apostasy, where Christians abandoned their faith and became Muslims. This happened particularly in areas like Albania. Today, the majority of the population in Albania are Muslim, but their ancestors were Orthodox Christians. And it was in the 18th century chiefly that they abandoned their ancestral faith. One way of combating this decline in Orthodox observance, this danger of falling away, because there were many material advantages in becoming a Muslim, wouldn't have to pay so many taxes, for example. One way of combating that was by direct missionary work. And here, a notable example from the late 18th century is Saint Cosmas the Aetolian, a monk of Mount Athos, who made a series of missionary journeys round the Greek world, stopping from place to place, setting up a great cross, summoning all the people and preaching to them the elementary elements of the Christian faith. Also, he founded schools, because he saw part of the problem was the Christian population were becoming illiterate and therefore knew nothing of what their faith amounted to. He founded over 200 schools. So that would be one way of trying to counteract the decline in orthodoxy after 300 and more years of Muslim rule, direct missionary work. Nicodemus and Macarius are missionaries of a different kind. They do not preach by going round the country, summoning the people and instructing them. They preach through their program of publications and writings, and through their teaching in particular that Christians must go regularly to communion. So, at a time of difficulty and discouragement for the Christian people, Nicodemus and Macarius seek to renew their hope through their publications, and most notably through the Philokalia. Let me mention what the title Philokalia means. It means love of beauty, love of all things beautiful, love of God as the source of beauty. The title Philokalia could mean just anthology, a collection of beautiful things. But I believe that the Philokalia is not just an arbitrary collection of beautiful texts on diverse topics bound up within the covers of a single volume. I believe that there is a unity to the Philokalia, a single purpose. And in my subsequent talks, I shall seek to distinguish where that unity lies.